bastante importante, Elisa Iannacone. Elisa, ela é embaixadora da Canon Europa, né? Então, além de fotógrafa, ela é diretora de fotografia, é filmmaker, cineasta, né? E ela produz conteúdos muito interessantes, né? Que tem um range bem diversificado, né? Partindo de gravações, né? De zonas de risco, indo até produções de alto nível, né?
It's like two completely different worlds, but I have found a way after many years to bring them together. And this is because of the impact of Cyclone Idai in Mozambique. After it hit Beira, it destroyed about 80% of the city. Over there, that's an image of a refugee in Calais, France. It was a refugee camp called the Jungle, which formed, and you have people from all over the world.
So they cut the falling leaves so the summer wouldn't end. So just a little longer he could hold her hand, hold her hand. As the moon now softly passes, I've come to understand why you had to part your heart from mine and let go of my hand. But we caught the falling leaves so the summer wouldn't end. So just a little longer you could hold my hand, hold my hand. Yes, we caught the falling leaves so the summer wouldn't end. So just a little longer you could hold my hand, hold my hand, hold my hand,
Right. So, thanks, guys. So as you can see, this is more creative, right? Now, this photographer, he's a conflict reporter. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's honestly one of the world's greatest veteran conflict reporters, James Natchway. And when I was younger, about 17, 18, he really inspired me. And he created something called witness photography. The whole objective of witness photography is that there have to be people that witness the worst things that happen in mankind, because if nobody does, then they'll be forgotten and they won't be a part of history. And so I thought to myself, what a wonderful legacy to do that with your life. And so what I decided to do was embark on conflict reporting. And so I started to go to protests. This, believe it or not, is in Canada. But already it was just learning about how do you work with tear gas? How do you work with rubber bullets? What is it like to be thinking about a frame and a camera when you're also worried about your own personal safety? This image is from Egypt in 2013. Basically, the first democratically elected president of Egypt came into power in 2013, Mohamed Morsi. And the now president of Egypt, Sisi, deposed him. So basically removed him. And thousands of people from all over Egypt came to Cairo to build a camp called Rabaa. And in Rabaa, basically they blocked all the streets. There was no passageways. And the military said, we are going to clear you. We are going to have to remove you at some point. Unfortunately, people didn't want to move because they wanted their president back, and this led to 120 people getting killed the first time they tried to clear the camp. Eventually, they decided, okay, if 120 people have been killed, we're going to protest even more. So the people didn't want to move, and then the military came again, and they said, we're going to bring water tanks, we're going to clear you. They didn't bring water tanks, they brought snipers. There were snipers from helicopters, there were military tanks. Unfortunately, one of the Reuters reporters was killed. One of the Sky News reporters was also killed. And we witnessed basically the history of a massacre. It's now called the Rabaa massacre. And so I'm going to give you an example of some of the footage of shooting in Egypt at this time. It is a little bit graphic, so once again, beware. But just so that you get the idea.
حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل يا بلديس يا رب يا رب يا رب.
We have nothing, no gun, no stone. What we do, what we have to protect ourselves. We talk about our opinion only, safely. We don't hit anyone. Why you hit us by this degree? Killing. We are enemies. We are enemies.
So I'm not going to show you all of it because it does get a little bit intense, and it's also not necessary. But basically, you get the sense of like shooting in conflict. It's quite stressful. Oftentimes, there are days where you can't really make it home. I've ended up staying at strangers' houses when I couldn't make it to my house because it was too dangerous because there were shootouts, or you're trying to find ways to upload your material to send it to the broadcasters, to send it to the outlets, and sometimes you don't have Wi-Fi, sometimes you're in really ridiculous conditions to try and get Wi-Fi, and it becomes quite stressful. The issue that I had with this kind of filmmaking was that inevitably there's a lot of red tape. So you risk your life for images, and then suddenly an outlet might say, oh, that's a great image, we'll pay you $1 for that image. Or that's a great image, and we can't show it because there's a dead body in it, and we can't show dead bodies on our outlet. So this, for example, happened with BBC. So I was reporting for BBC World News sometimes, and there were some of the images that could not be shown. And I was getting really frustrated because in some of the images you can see, hundreds of people that were killed. I personally counted about 250 bodies when I was working in one of the mosques, when I was working basically in this mosque. You couldn't show it. Even though you don't see people's faces, they didn't want to show the scale. And this made me very frustrated because to this day, a lot of people in Egypt don't know what happened. The Egyptian media is controlled by the military. It's now still controlled by the presidency. And unfortunately, they don't know that this actually happened. So for me, I was like, okay, well, why am I risking my life to tell a story that's not even going to make it out to inform people, right? Just as an anecdote, I remember when I was shooting in this particular mosque, I was wearing white socks. And when I went to put my shoes back on, because in Egypt you take your shoes off when you go into mosques, my socks were completely red. And I hadn't noticed, because the carpet's red, that I was actually walking on blood the whole time that I was shooting. So you really are kind of operating in this really heightened level of adrenaline all the time. This was in Iraq, a Syrian refugee camp, and this was actually one of the most difficult interviews of my entire life. I was trying to do a report for an entity called Islamic Relief, and basically they wanted to have an analysis on domestic violence in Syrian refugee camps. And this woman told me that her husband had basically strangled their nephew to death while he was sexually assaulting him because he was being too loud. And this was a breaking point for me because I was crying when she was telling the story behind the camera, and I was shooting it, and I knew it was important to witness, but for me the transaction was not equal because I was taking a story, it was going to go into some statistical report, some kind of analysis, but we weren't really tangibly giving anything back to her, right? I remembered this quote by Susan Sontag, which is basically about how being spectators of war and calamities and pain is something that we see in our living rooms now. We have it in our phones, we have it in our laptops. We are so used to witnessing pain that we have to desensitize from it, Initially she says, the response is compassion, indignation, titillation, or approval as each misery heaves into view. But what happens now with Instagram and Facebook and all the social media and all of the channels being on our phones is that we have a saturation of images of pain. And so we get compassion fatigue because we cannot connect to everything all the time at the same heightened level. We'd just be crying all the time, right? So how do I connect these two seemingly different worlds? Well, unfortunately, something bad had to happen to me, which was that I was sexually assaulted by a family member in Mexico. And just like Brazil, I'm sure that topic is incredibly taboo in this country too. I discovered that a lot of women in my family had also been sexually assaulted, and they wanted to remain silent about it, and I decided that I did not. Unfortunately, that meant that I'm now estranged from the entirety of my extended family. The only people that believed me were my parents. And I decided, okay, I want to tell the story of what happened to me, but I don't know how. So first I went to art therapy. I didn't know that art therapy existed, but the Canadian government put me into a program. And then I discovered that when I couldn't communicate because the words would fail me, I was actually able to think of images. So we could play, we could draw, we could, sing, dance, whatever. I started Googling images of sexual violence, right? And this is what I got. I was very disappointed because they're all black and white. They're all about women being victims, right? And they're also re-victimizing victims. And this is what I found a lot of journalism does, is we go in there in a moment of serious trauma to take someone's story without giving them the capacity to actually consent or choose whether they want that story to be told in that way, right? I saw some that had a little bit more color, but unfortunately still not something like, when I look at that woman, I don't want to be her. Like I felt like, okay, she's forever looking like a victim in my mind, right? I decided to flip things around and be inspired by art therapy, and I created a project called The Spiral of Containment: Rape's Aftermath. So I worked with 25 rape survivors from all over the world, each one attached to one particular color in the color wheel. And these were all colors that emerged organically through conversations that we had together. So this is the first image that I made about rape, right? I spoke to a woman that said that she had been raped in her sleep and that she felt like Sleeping Beauty and she could have stayed in that tower forever. Now, I was a little bit confused because the only version of Sleeping Beauty that I knew was from Disney. But actually, the original Sleeping Beauty story from the 1600s is called The Sun, the Moon, and Talia. And this story is actually about a princess that's asleep in her castle. Prince comes in through the window. He's married, by the way. He has his own family. Rapes her, and then leaves her and goes back to his family. She gives birth. She's still sleeping. She gives birth to twins, and one of the twins actually sucks the splinter out of her finger, and then she wakes up. So then she realizes what's happened, etc. So Sleeping Beauty is actually, unfortunately, a story about sexual violence. So when I heard that, I kind of went, wow, this is actually a very accessible story. Internationally, we all know the story of Sleeping Beauty. And so I'm going to start shooting this. I didn't know what I was doing back then. I just shot one image. But then a few more started to emerge. So I went to different parts of the world. This is in Johannesburg. And in Johannesburg, in South Africa, they have one of the highest incidences of sexual violence in the world towards men and women. And so I spoke to a woman and she said, I feel like I'm forever going to be standing at the edge of the abyss with a broken dress. And this broken dress, she really felt connected to yellow. And I was like, why yellow? And she goes, well, because my life was bright. I had a career, I had a relationship, I had all of these great things going for me. And then somebody came and broke it. So I'm always going to be standing like at the edge of an abyss, right? So I thought to myself, what a powerful image, an abyss. How do I find an abyss? So I went on Google Maps and I found this abyss. This is a building in South Africa. That's residential. It's got 3,800 people living in there today. It looks abandoned. And I noticed that it had that little balcony in the middle. When I got there, it turned out the balcony wasn't in use, so we had to break some locks, and I managed to actually get in there. And we also had to saw open a window because there was no window that would open.
Oh, wow. Okay, we have audio.
So that's basically how I found my frame. I had to go up and down all these stories, look at the balcony, see where I wanted to have my frame, persuade the building management to saw open the window, and then I was locked in. I couldn't change my frame anymore, right? Then we had pieces of fabric. So this broken dress in my mind, I thought it was going to be this huge kind of layered thing, right? And I got 200 meters of Indian cotton fabric, which was the lightest fabric I could find. And then we attached it to rope. And once again, because none of the windows open, I had to attach it to the very, very roof of the building. So that's how we were moving everything.
It's fine.
And then that's what happened, right? So basically, this is my favorite kind of work now. And the reason for that is that I've remained friends with most of the people that I've worked with in this project. And she said to me just last year, this is like 5 or 6 years after we shot the image, she said, I feel like that shoot is the moment that I went from like victim to survivor, right? So that's the moment that I actually feel like I managed to overcome what had happened. Secondly, after we finished shooting this, she asked if we could call this The Kingdom. And I said, why would you want to call this photograph The Kingdom? And she said, because as I was sitting there moving all of these broken pieces of fabric, I felt like I was commanding them back into my life, and I felt like the queen of my kingdom. Now, as someone that's been through art therapy, I felt what an incredible shift to go from A to B in such a short period of time. Then the transaction felt very different to the situation in Iraq, right? Where I had gone and taken someone's story that was really, really traumatic and really not given much back. Here I felt like we'd actually found a mechanism to help someone in their healing journey. And I was also healing myself as well every time that I heard one of these stories, right? So this is just a close-up of her in the balcony so that you can see her. So this is the methodology of how I work with people. I will have an interview. It's 100% journalistic, and then they'll start to say things that stay in my mind. So, for example, I spoke to a man that had been assaulted by a guy that was in a red classic convertible car. So in my mind, I thought, okay, red classic convertible car. Then he said, everything around me felt like a circus, right? So already the color red and circus was kind of aligning in my mind. he was actually speaking about how he couldn't remember anyone's faces, but just that feeling that there was chaos, right? So I thought, okay, what if I shoot this with a slow shutter speed to create that illusion that, you know, people are faceless around him. So I drew this. I had to build all of those things, bird cages. He was talking about a bird that wouldn't stop speaking while this was happening, so the bird was very important. And then I execute the image, and that's basically how it translates. So obviously, while we were shooting this from a technical perspective, we had a slow shutter, and everybody was just shaking like this the whole time to be blurry in the background, and he was staying very, very, very still. And then we just had a flash on him at the very, very end of the exposure, right? And I mean, the one thing about this is that a lot of people say, oh, how can you handle telling all these stories? They're so painful, right? But I'd love to see somebody in this audience that has never experienced any kind of pain, right? And I don't think that anyone will be able to actually raise their hands, because we all have these experiences. And I find that working in this way, I'm actually able to understand more about the human condition and actually help someone in their process. And they're stories of empowerment, right? These are people that have chosen not to be defined by what happened to them and that want to basically express something in a different way, right? So this one was very important to me because, you know, when I did all the Google searches and everybody was in black and white and all the victims were women, a lot of sexual violence happens to men. And I'm sure in this room it's happened to someone. And I don't think that that story is told enough because the taboo is really great. And he said to me, everything around me felt normal when I was growing up. But I knew that when that shadow was coming into my room, that something weird was going to happen. But again, I just thought it was normal, right? So we have the shadow. Unfortunately, in this particular instance, the perpetrator was actually a woman. So it was his mother figure. That was the abuser until he was 12 years old. And so that also is an important story because there are lots of cases of women that are actually in the position of the perpetrator, but we don't like to tell those stories either, right? So when I embark on these, you know, these are just visual references. I was looking at shadows. How do I build that shadow on the wall? How do I, you know, look at what kind of wallpaper am I going to use? It's kind of like you're going to go and shoot a narrative production, right? You just have a social context. Oops. Sorry, I have the audios. Each image has an audio of the person telling you the story, but then I'll really make you cry, and I'm not trying to do that. So this is some of the behind the scenes. That's my husband actually on the right, whom incidentally I met when I was shooting in South Africa. And this is a woman from the Xhosa group. And we basically mixed cultures here. As I mentioned, I'm from Mexico, so Day of the Dead is a very strong visual in my mind. And she wanted to have all of those elements, I think I've got it. So the drum, the skins, all of these things here, the beads, they're all representative of her ancestors. And she was very upset with her ancestors because they did not protect her when this happened, right? So she wanted that to be present. Somehow, though, even though this happened, she managed to stay afloat. So this image is called Staying Afloat because it's about somebody that, despite all odds, she thought she might pass away, but she managed to keep going.
I think I was obedient.
Okay. And these are some other examples from the project, right? So that you can get the sense. She's an Olympic medal winner, actually. And when I asked her and I said, you know, how did you win an Olympic medal? And she said, I ran as fast as I could, as far as I could from home, and set it all alight. And then the laundry on the sides is just because she said she kept washing, right? So once again, it's when you're sitting down with someone and they're telling you, you know what, I used to keep, you know, I used to keep washing clothes because I felt dirty. In your mind, you're already going like, okay, laundry, that's kind of an important element. I set it all alight. Okay, I set my home alight. Fire, how do we exemplify fire? And it's not literal. None of this is literal. They're the images that kind of stay at the back of your mind. And it's collaborating with people to construct them, right? So I did this whole project, and it was madness, because it was very difficult to put together. It was almost impossible to fund. And basically, that's how I got a stronger connection with Canon. So my first camera I bought when I was in university, and I ate a stringent diet of rice and beans for about a month to be able to afford it, because as we all know, they're not the cheapest thing in the universe. But these cameras actually managed to take me all over the world. Initially as a photojournalist and documentary filmmaker, and now creating these kinds of overlapping stories. Now, my personal story was the first one that I thought of when I created this project. And I guess I'll just show it to you, and hopefully it'll just tell the story by itself. Okay, so what's kind of nice about this project as well is that when I first started art therapy, my image of myself was just kind of completely bare with broken wings, no feathers. Other people were flying, but I couldn't, right? That was it. When I finished this project, I felt like my wings were full again. I was like, you know what? I can do this. Like, I'm okay. But then when what I discovered was that healing trauma is actually cyclical in nature. You know, you're up, you're down. You can experience a car crash. You can experience so many different things. And you might get triggers that take you back, right? So the reason for the name of the project, The Spiral of Containment, is this kind of cyclical, circular nature of healing trauma. Now, I discovered also, I turned it into a book as well, which was basically where I put it all together. I worked with other kinds of topics. I thought to myself, okay, is it possible to use this and create work with other kinds of thematics that are not sexual violence, like other kinds of topics, right? And so I created a project called Humans of the Forgotten War, and this has got to do with the war in Cameroon. How do you showcase refugees, right? Because refugees generally, like in the Syrian refugee camp, they're dressed a particular way. Generally, they're shot in a tent. They're made to look a particular way, right? But they come from cultures that are incredibly colorful. They're really wonderful cultures. And their attire, the things that they wear, are generally really beautiful, right? And we don't get a chance to see that. So I wanted to tell stories of displacement through textiles. This is traditional Cameroonian attire, and this is what this man already had. And then we put South African shwe fabric behind him. So these are the two countries, basically, that he's from, and we're telling that journey through the textiles, right? Once again, putting this really strong blue color, which is something that he already owned, right, against the South African shwe fabric. So you can tell stories of displacement through textiles. Here, we had people that needed to be anonymous for the sakes of staying safe, right? And so what I decided to do was use masks, because every time somebody wants to be anonymous, they use silhouettes. And I'm kind of tired of silhouetting. I feel like it's almost like a cheap way to just, oh, we don't know what to do, we can't show your face, just face a window and we'll silhouette you. I wanted something more interesting to the eye, right? So we created things like this, and worked in an old apartheid prison in South Africa, where we were actually able to work with Cameroonian refugees who were in South Africa that were representing how people behind bars in Cameroon were made to feel. And they kept saying things like, we feel abandoned, we feel like we're treated like animals, we feel faceless. So that's why we used all the masks when we were working on that project. Then I worked with children, you know, children that had experienced serious trauma, orphans, people that, you know, are scared of the gaze of society. And basically that's what that image is about confronting society, looking at you differently when something has happened to you as a child, right? And we created this series, A Place to Hide from Monsters, because most kids were talking about how there were monsters under the bed. And maybe she was scared about what could be underneath her bed, or there are monsters in society that want to do something to me, and then they were concerned about that. So this is just a behind the scenes. So I also got some video about these pieces. And then I worked in hospitals. So this is more aspirational work, because first it was quite literal about the interviews. This was, where do children's minds go when they're stuck in a hospital and, you know, they spend most of their days there, and some of them want to go fly away in a balloon. Some of them want to eat all the cakes in the world. Other ones want their bed to turn into a Formula 1 car. And so this was great because you're taking children out of a position where they're stuck, you know, they're always seeing the same things every day, cycling in their minds. And they can actually go elsewhere. So she wants to be a diva at the Met Gala, and she wanted to wear the biggest dress, and she wanted it to be pink. And what was really lucky is that all of the beds in this hospital room were actually already pink, so that was very, very helpful. This one, for example, we used elements from the hospitals. So as you can see, the wheels are made with wheelchairs. So there are things that we found there, and then they're covered with masks. So they're face masks. We also have, so these are all face masks. This is like athletes' tape. So people that have to perform a lot of sports sometimes need this kind of tape. And then we had here doctors' gloves. And then we put some kind of food coloring into just water to kind of bring a little bit of magic to an otherwise quite dull space, right? Funny story with some of these is that obviously permits in South Africa are quite different to other parts of the world. So now, as I mentioned, I live in the UK. Shooting in a hospital isn't that easy. Access isn't that easy. In this hospital, that door up there is an emergency neonatal passageway where people need to cross to another door that's actually off camera over here. And so every so often while we were shooting, we would have people running through with babies, just being like, oh my God, we need to get through. And when I got permission to shoot there, nobody told me that this was a neonatal passageway. And I was like, how is it possible you gave me permission to shoot here? This is crazy. But you know, Africa, very much like Latin America, it's the rules are very flexible. So anyways, now, this is something that, a question I get often is like, what about money? How do you commercialize all of these works? And the thing is, after several years of working in this, now I'm getting paid by different kinds of entities that want to showcase what they're doing through a social justice kind of angle. So for example, this is a festival in Barcelona. They work entirely with people that have different kinds of mental health issues, and they're the performers, they're the singers. And so we created a series for them to do their marketing campaign, basically, with the people that are the performers that have all of these kinds of issues, right? So it's taken many, many years, but we finally got there. Now, back in 2019, oh, hang on, there we go. Let's go back. 1 second, there we go. Okay, back in 2019, I was actually living in Ukraine. And this was a complete fluke because I obviously didn't know what was going to happen. And I was doing a report for Newsweek in a more journalistic capacity, so I got a chance to interview President Zelensky and the ministers and many of the people that were actually in the country. And once the war began, I thought to myself, is there a way to shoot this not like I did Egypt, which is the pure journalistic way? Is there actually a way that you can address war mixing two worlds? And so I created a campaign called Strong Enough, as you can see here on the sweater. It was created because one of the most incredible things that I know about Ukraine is that the people are massively resilient. They come together in a way that I've never seen in any other conflict. And no matter what's happening, they always say, we are strong enough, right? So we made it in traditional Vyshyvanka patterns. Vyshyvanka is just the kind of wording kind of style, design style that they have in the country. And I can show you the video that we put together for this campaign.
Ой, у лузі червона калина ухилилася. Чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми тую червону калину
Right, so that was a way to kind of mix two worlds. I worked with people in Ukraine, where we went to some of the bombed out buildings, obviously, and for anyone who's following that war in Busha, Borodyanka, and Irpin, close to Kyiv. And then I also worked with people that had managed to escape the war and were now in London. And we found an airfield, we found someone to loan us a plane, basically, to wrap it, and that's how we were able to put together that. And then similarly to the kids in the hospital, I actually worked with children in a hospital in Ukraine who have been displaced from their homes in the war, and oftentimes they cannot get access to the healthcare that they need in the city that they're from. So this was in Lviv, which is very close to the Polish border. And this child, for example, said, "Oh, I wish my bed would turn into a monster truck." You start to see little boys in hospitals. It doesn't matter what country they're from. They have very similar visuals sometimes. And this one's actually quite interesting because it's a young girl. She's 3 years old. And when I went to the hospital, I was quite nervous because I thought, gosh, a 3-year-old, like that's very young. I'd never worked with someone that young. And her mother was present, and I said to her, "How aware is your child of the war, you know?" And she said, no, like she's fully aware, like this is our entire life at the moment, right? So I spoke to the girl and eventually kind of got to understand what she was afraid of. And she said her biggest fear was Sirena Galova. Sirena Galova is a monster in Ukrainian folklore. And it doesn't have a face, but it has 2 big air raid sirens on each side. And so obviously in Ukraine, they're scared of the air raid sirens because whenever there's an air raid, they go off and you have to find your nearest bunker. So imagine that a 3-year-old is actually cognizant of that. And she went, "I'm scared of the air raid sirens. And I also, wish that I could give this monster a letter." And I said, "Okay, that's very interesting. What do you want to put in your letter?" And she said, "Well, I don't know yet." Fine. And I said, "What do you need in order to confront the monster?" And she said, "I need lots of magic wands." So we created this idea of like several magic wands and her actually coming out to face this monster. And when she came out initially, she was a little bit scared of the monster, but it took some time to just show her, it's not real. This is just what we've been chatting about. And what was really sweet is that I gave her a piece of paper, which is the one that she's holding in her hand, to just write her letter to the monster. And all she wrote was, "Dear Sirena Galova, Superman will beat you." Which I thought was very sweet. But as you can see here, it's like this is not just going in and taking a photo of a poor children in the hospital that have the war and whatever. It's actually trying to engage and to understand the psychology of like what's going on in your brain right now. Like what are you afraid of? What is it that you want to kind of achieve? And I can guarantee that she will remember this for a long time. And also the fact that she was able to deliver this letter from a psychological perspective is quite therapeutic. It's being able to confront a big fear that you have. So anyways, that is basically what I am about. I don't know if anyone's got any questions regarding the work thus far, but I can open it up. Oh, yes. Oh, and I think, do they have, okay, hold on 1 second. You need a microphone.
So, hi.
Hello.
My name is Gabriella, and I'm also a photographer. And I really enjoy your work. I didn't know you, and congratulations.
Thank you.
How do you, this kind of seems like an HR question, but it's not. But you live in 2 different worlds. Actually, like, how do you manage to deal with issues on the perspective of chaos and the other perspective of, like, with a lot of projection behind it? Like, what's your, I don't know, the most issues you have to deal with and how you dealt with?
Like straddling both worlds, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it wasn't until something bad happened to me and that I went to art therapy that I realized that those 2 worlds are actually the same. In my mind, these 2 worlds exist completely together. Because when we experience things in our mind, we have literal memory and then we have emotional and imaginary kinds of concoctions that come up in our brain, right? So when you think of something, you might remember the literal thing that happened, but you might also remember the feeling of maybe you felt you were underwater. Maybe you felt you could fly. You're so happy you could fly. And this is where magic realism comes in literature, and we're in Latin America. This is huge, right? You know, she was so angry that she burned her way through the barn. I mean, I've felt so angry sometimes that I feel the whole world should be on fire. You know what I mean? And these are just images that are not the literal situation of what's happening, but it's the expression of it emotionally through images. And so for me, they're tied together. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, but how do you emotionally deal with it? Like,
Yeah. Well, I cry. I cry when I have to cry. I have a therapist. But I think, you know, well, and you know what? Like, well before I was doing this kind of work, when I was just doing pure conflict and stuff, I think that's a good question to ask yourself if you're ever pursuing any kind of job. If you want a corporate job or a stable job or not stable job, the question is, why? Why am I pursuing this line of work, right? And I needed to make a pause in my life at one point, because I came from a challenging family, you know, Latin American family, lots of macho kind of situations at home, lots of violence at home. And for me, you know, even today, going to Ukraine is sometimes easier than going home. So I had to kind of do a little bit of work on myself to understand why I was doing what I was doing. And now when I go to these kinds of situations, I tend to curate them. I tend to really choose the project that I really, really want to tell that story. And Ukraine is big for me because I lived there, and I have friends, and you know, it's kind of part of my heart, right? But I won't go to every front line, and I won't, you know, do all of that anymore. But indeed, I think you need to write, you need to cry, you need to speak to your friends, journal, and certainly have a therapist.
thank you.
No worries. Anyone else?
Good evening. I would
Good
just
evening.
like to start saying thank you for sharing your work. It's pretty amazing.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your time here, and you're always welcome in our country. But what I do have to say is you've definitely shown us and explained to us the way that this is a form of therapy. You have dealt with therapy before by yourself, and this is a way that you have found to also help other people to deal with their conflicts. They may be like physical or even internal things. But what is the aftermath? Like, how well do the people that you have interacted with react after you have shown that there is hope after those photo shoots?
That's a great question. And I wouldn't call this therapy per se, because I'm not a therapist myself.
Right.
So it's therapeutic, but I couldn't call it therapy. So what's really cool is that with a university in the UK, I actually got to go back and interview people from the very first project. So from the sexual violence project, we interviewed about 50% of them to see years later how they had felt having been a part of something like this. And the overarching response was that they found a form of justice. So that's something that I hadn't considered, is the fact that legal systems around the world, and we know very much in Latin America, Africa, Asia, the legal system is never going to protect the victims. And that's a global issue, you know. Rarely are people that have experienced this kind of thing going to experience justice through the legal system, right? So then the definition of justice becomes in question. How do I find a sense of justice when the legal system's not going to protect me? And so by doing things like this, we find that people can be witnessed, their story can be heard. Stories of trauma are all about taking power away from someone, right? And so when you collaborate with them to tell their story in a way that they want it to be told, you're shifting power back. And that in itself is a massive change that happens in their kind of mind frame. So it was actually a really kind of surprisingly, but you know, heartwarmingly positive response. And indeed, I am sure also that there would be someone that maybe years later maybe goes, ugh, I kind of don't like my photo, or I don't feel like I'm in that place anymore, or maybe that's annoying. But in the end, all I can do is try to be very clear from the beginning that I'm interpreting. I cannot actually be your mind. I need to extrapolate, I need to collaborate, and I will try my best to tell that story. But I think overarchingly, it's been very positive thus far.
That's amazing. That's really amazing.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think at the back there's several questions.
Hi, first of all, thank you for showing your pictures. And I'm actually curious to know that how other people that look at your work, how they feel. Like, do you think the way you portray the images is like a easier way to start a conversation about the subject? Or, I don't know, maybe some people don't like the way you portray those types of situation. I'm kind of curious to know if, how about that?
Sure. So one of the big questions I had initially is that really shook me up was, why did you choose to make rape beautiful? And that scared me because I was like, ooh, why did I do that? But actually, that's not what it is. And what I came to is that, you know those images of Google, the sexual violence black and white ones? Those are really disempowered people. So that's looking at victims being super re-victimized, right? And so what I was trying to do was shift that power back. Just because something horrible has happened to someone, it doesn't mean that your whole life should be perceived in black and white. You know, I remember seeing some of the photos from Lebanon. I don't know if you guys followed that here. There was a big explosion in Lebanon not too long ago. And there were pictures of people that were half naked on the street. And I just thought to myself, that's made it onto the cover of Time magazine. That's the way, if I'm that man, right? And I'm on the cover of Time magazine and I'm half naked and I'm running away from a horrible explosion, right? That's the way that I'm known to the world now. I find it very difficult to move on my own personal story when that's the visual that's out. But when you make a visual like this, people kind of go, actually, this horrible thing happened, but I can pack my bags and walk away, and I like to be dressed in orange, or I like to be the queen of my kingdom, and this is who I am. So I think that it's much more empowering, and it's about, yeah, people are beautiful, and horrible things happen, but that doesn't take away their beauty. And I think photojournalism is too focused on the, it's a reason that they call conflict reporters vultures, and we have the vulture club and these kinds of things, because we almost like prey on these horrible things. But I think that sometimes we go there because we think that if it bleeds, it leads, and it should be on the news. But actually, we are desensitizing, I feel, as humans. And I think shifting back to stories like this, for me, is important. That's all I can say.
Hi. Well, first of all, congratulations for your work. It was amazing. And I realized that you use, both for the kids and this fantasy universe and for the sexual assault project, a lot of chaos in the image. The dressing, the art direction, the things are put in chaotic form. And is this, for your conception, from the trauma is chaotic, or the healing is chaotic, or both of them? And how do you feel this when you are composing the image?
So I don't know if I can go back that far, but I can try. I'll keep scrolling. Basically, it all depends on the stage at which the person is, right? So I'm not trying to dictate to them, oh, this image should be very chaotic or not. So this one, for example, in my mind, this image is very serene, right, in a way. And this was one of the people in the project. And for her, she just wanted to be, this one's called Broken Cactus, right? And actually, this person is my cousin. She's like the only people that actually reached out to me from my family when she discovered I was doing this project to try and be in it. So. But basically, she said she wanted to be standing looking at the horizon because she feels like a broken cactus, all punctured, but somehow still standing strong. So we found the perfect cactus, a bit of an abandoned environment, which is a big juxtaposition to something like that, right? Which is much more chaotic. And that emerged from her. So it emerges directly from the person. I'm just asking questions, kind of being like, okay, well, what's the story like? And she just went, the moment I told my family, it was like an explosion. Like everything went off, everything happened, and that was chaos. So I'm not the person dictating whether it's chaos or not. I'm just listening. And if a person's focused on the chaos, everything that was going on, that's what I tried to emulate. If somebody's focused on the more kind of serene observational, that's what I tried to emulate. So I let them dictate, if that makes sense. Yeah? Cool. Oh, yeah.
Just because caught my attention that yours specifically is one of the cleanest one. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, initially, all I could imagine in art therapy was an empty space, like I had nothing. For me, it was actually quite surprising to hear other people's stories and understand that they had so many layers. Like some of them were so connected to colors and textures and smells. When I first started, I wanted to invite people to my kitchen to just work on what our broken wings look like, and maybe we could make a collage. And that was an assumption on my part, that everybody had an image of broken wings. Then they were like, it's a red classic car. No, it's a dress. No, it's that. And I was like, oh, okay. But I think for me, that's just the way I saw it. And initially it was just going to be that one photo, but because, as I mentioned, you know, that cyclical nature of healing, I turned it into a hologram, because that project took about 8 years to put together from beginning to end, which is a very long time. And so I wanted to show kind of that journey arc through turning it into a projection. Yeah.
Hello.
Oh, hello. Hello, where? Oh, yeah, there. Okay. Hi.
I really like the photos and videos that you showed from Egypt. And I would like to know how it all started. Like, you went to a volunteer program, you randomly went to Egypt, or you had someone that you knew from Egypt. How was this process?
I mean, I basically bought a plane ticket and decided that I was ready. So for a very long time, I'd been covering protests. Every time something was going wrong, I kind of had this gravitational pull to go and cover it wherever I was. So that's why I started in Canada when I was in university, just covering protests, you know. I went to do my master's degree in the UK, and in the UK I specialized in conflict zones. So it was a master's degree that was international journalism, so it was production, TV production, but I streamed into conflict. So the two things that I think are really important if you want to go into that line of work is, first of all, take a hostile environment course. You will be able to find one of those in Brazil. And basically there are courses where they put you through different kinds of scenarios. What would happen if somebody kidnaps you? What would happen if you experience a shootout or anything like this? And they will train you to respond. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is you have to feel ready, right? Like, since I was quite young in Mexico, I worked on ambulances. Knowing kind of your basic emergencies aid is really important. And at some point, maybe your gut just knows, okay, I think I'm ready to go and do this. And so I bought a ticket to Egypt. As soon as I got there, I connected with other photojournalists, and then I just started going out. And it was pretty extreme because I didn't know it was going to get that bad. Initially, I was just covering some simple protests, but then we're using, you know, tear gas masks every day and getting shot at every day, and it gets complicated. You know, if you go to those environments, you have to be prepared to answer the question, why did I do this, if you were to lose a leg or if you were to end up in prison or anything like that. You know, you have to be very clear that this is really what you want to do, because the consequences are your life, right? So, but yeah, I just felt ready and I wanted to go.
How do you start a conversation with someone that has a history that is so deeply emotionally involved? Like, how do you, actually it's two questions. How do you select the people that you shoot? And how you start a conversation so you can actually hear the real story?
So the sexual violence project was easier in that it had happened to me. So I was able to reach out to rape crisis centers, psychologists, hospitals, and say, hey, you know, this is my background, this is what I do, and I'm working on a project of this nature. Would you be interested in connecting me to any of your clients? And then as soon as they did that, I would get like so many messages on my phone. And then it was about decanting, because I had to work with a therapist to come up with a line of questioning to understand if somebody was ready to do this kind of work. Some people say, I really want to do this, but they'd just been assaulted like the week before or something. So you you want to give people time, right? So it was gauging that. In some instances, I actually had psychologists on set. So if there was somebody that I felt, okay, we might need extra support, we just had their therapist come to the shoot and things like that. But it's always different. I mean, they're the same skills that you would use in journalistic kinds of interviews, right? You have to be very sensitive, very empathetic. You have to be a good listener. And above all, you have to be incredibly respectful that somebody is gifting you their time and their stories. And yeah, and I think now we are time. Yes, excellent. Well, time's up, but thank you so much, everyone. I'll be around if anyone has other questions.
Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you, Elisa. Thank you for your presence, okay?
Thank you.
Gente, vamos ter que sair agora da sala para a gente poder montar rapidinho até outra mesa. Agradeço ao Canon pela parceria, e também a Elisa, Fábio e Ângela, tá bom? Muitíssimo obrigado, gente.
What to do to blow my mind. You're from another planet. I've never felt like this. I don't know how I ever survived without it. I'm starry-eyed. Got me upside down, spinning around you. Wanna taste the clouds, dance with the moon. Take a trip around your body. Boy, I love the way you got me. Starry-eyed, got me starry-eyed. This bed is out of space, just keep painting constellations.